The rain had been falling for hours, each drop creating tiny rivers down the windows of Murphy's Diner. It was the kind of evening that made people want to stay inside, wrapped in warmth and light. The small-town establishment glowed like a beacon against the gray October sky, its neon sign flickering occasionally but never quite giving up. Commander Thomas Ellis sat in the corner booth, the same one he'd claimed every Tuesday for the past 3 months. His weathered hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that had seen better days, much like himself. The coffee had gone cold 20 minutes ago, but he continued to hold it, finding comfort in the familiar weight. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, a habit from 43 years of service, and his worn leather jacket hung loose on shoulders that had once carried the weight of responsibility for hundreds of officers under his command. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't need to. The waitress, Betty, had learned his routine by now. Tomato soup, black coffee, and a slice of apple pie that he rarely finished. She'd bring it without being asked, understanding that some customers preferred their solitude. Thomas appreciated that about her. No small talk, no questions about his day, no attempts to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. Tonight felt different, though. Heavier somehow. The anniversary was approaching. 3 months since he'd turned in his badge. 3 months since the department had thrown him a retirement party he'd barely stayed an hour for. Everyone had made speeches about his dedication, his service, his legacy. But what they hadn't mentioned was how empty the silence would become afterward. The bell above the door chimed, its brass surface tarnished with age, but still managing to announce each arrival with the same cheerful ding. Thomas didn't look up. He'd learned to recognize the sounds of the diner. The shuffle of Betty's worn sneakers on linoleum, the hiss of the coffee machine, the gentle scrape of chairs being pulled out from tables. These were the sounds that had become his evening soundtrack, replacing the familiar chaos of the precinct that had been his second home for so many years. But tonight, the footsteps were different, more purposeful. The quiet murmur of voices carried a tone he recognized. The easy camaraderie of officers coming off shift, that particular blend of exhaustion and relief that came with surviving another day on the force. Thomas had heard it thousands of times, had been a part of it for decades. Now it was just another sound from a world he no longer belonged to. 5 young police officers entered, their uniforms still crisp despite the long shift. They moved with the unconscious confidence of those who had found their place in the world, who knew their purpose and carried it with pride. Thomas remembered that feeling, remembered when putting on the uniform each morning had felt like putting on armor, preparing for whatever the day might bring. Officer Lena Perez was the first to speak, her voice carrying the easy warmth of someone who genuinely enjoyed the company of her colleagues. "I swear, if I have to chase down one more teenager on a stolen bike, I'm going to start questioning my career choices," she said, sliding into the booth near the window. Her partners laughed, settling in around her with the familiar ease of a team that had learned to rely on each other. "At least you didn't have to explain to Mrs. Henderson why her cat was stuck in the same tree for the 3rd time this month," Officer Martinez replied, shaking his head. "That woman thinks we're the fire department, animal control, and personal therapists all rolled into one." "Speaking of personal therapists," Officer Chen interjected, "did you hear about the domestic call on 5th Street? Took 2 hours to talk the guy down. Sometimes I think we need psychology degrees more than law enforcement training." The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by the occasional laugh or groan of recognition. These were the stories that bonded officers together. The absurd, the challenging, the moments that reminded them why they'd chosen this profession despite all its difficulties. Thomas found himself listening, despite his intention to remain detached, drawn into their world by the familiar rhythm of their experiences. Officer Perez was in the middle of describing a particularly difficult arrest when she noticed something that made her pause mid-sentence. The old man in the corner booth had reached for his coffee cup, and as he lifted it, his jacket sleeve pulled back just enough to reveal his forearm. There, etched in faded blue ink, was a tattoo that made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't an elaborate design, just 3 simple elements that together told a story known only to those who had earned the right to hear it. An eagle in flight, wings spread wide in a display of power and freedom. Below it, a badge rendered in careful detail, every line and curve exactly as it appeared on the real thing. And beneath that, numbers that meant nothing to most people, but everything to those who understood their significance. Officer Perez had seen that tattoo before, though not in person. It was legendary among the officers in their precinct, part of the folklore that got passed down from veteran to rookie, from one generation of law enforcement to the next. Those numbers represented something that no longer existed, a special unit that had been formed in the early days of the department, when the city was smaller and the challenges were different but no less real. She whispered to Officer Martinez, who was sitting closest to her, "Do you see that man in the corner? Look at his arm when he moves." Her voice carried an urgency that immediately caught the attention of her colleagues. They followed her gaze discreetly, watching as the old man continued his solitary meal, oblivious to their scrutiny. "Holy shit," Martinez whispered back, his usual composure cracking slightly. "Is that—" "Commander Ellis," Perez confirmed, her voice barely audible. "It has to be. That's the Unit 7 tattoo. Only 12 officers ever carried those numbers, and as far as I know, he's the only one still alive." The table fell silent. Each officer turned to look more carefully at the man who had become the subject of their sudden attention. Thomas Ellis. They all knew the name, knew the stories, knew the reputation. He was a legend in their department, a man whose career had spanned decades and whose influence had shaped the way they did their jobs, even though most of them had never met him. Officer Chen, the youngest of the group at 24, looked confused. "Who is Commander Ellis?" she asked, clearly not recognizing the name that had caused such a reaction in her colleagues. Officer Williams, a 10-year veteran who had joined the force straight out of college, leaned forward to explain. Thomas Ellis was a commander for 30 years. He started as a beat cop in the 70s, worked his way up through every rank, every division. He was the one who modernized our training protocols, who pushed for better equipment, who fought the city council for better pay and benefits. But more than that, he was the kind of officer who never forgot where he came from. "I heard he once walked into a hostage situation unarmed," Martinez added, his voice filled with a mixture of respect and disbelief. "Convinced the gunman to surrender just by talking to him. No shots fired, no one hurt. That was his style. He believed in using his brain before his weapon." Perez nodded, her eyes never leaving the old man in the corner. "He saved my life once," she said quietly. "I was a rookie, maybe 3 weeks out of the academy, Responded to a domestic violence call without waiting for backup. Stupid mistake. The guy had a knife, and I was cornered in the kitchen. Ellis came through the back door like some kind of guardian angel. Didn't draw his weapon, didn't raise his voice, just walked in and started talking to the guy like they were old friends. She paused, remembering that night with the clarity that comes from having your life changed in an instant. The whole time, he was positioning himself between me and the suspect, giving me a chance to get out safely. I didn't even realize what he was doing until afterward. He made it look effortless, like he was just having a conversation. But I know he risked his life for a rookie he'd never met before. The officers looked at Thomas with new understanding. Here was a man who had spent his career looking out for others, who had made countless sacrifices for the safety of his community and his fellow officers. And now, he sat alone, eating soup in a diner where no one recognized him, where his decades of service were invisible to everyone except the 5 young officers who had stumbled upon him by chance. "Why doesn't he come to the station anymore?" Chen asked. "I mean, retired officers usually stop by sometimes, right?" "Stay connected?" Williams shook his head. "From what I heard, he had a falling out with the new administration. The current chief wanted to modernize everything, change all the protocols Ellis had spent years developing. There was some kind of conflict about budget priorities. Ellis wanted more money for community outreach programs, but the chief preferred high-tech equipment. Politics, you know. He was forced into retirement," Martinez added grimly. "Officially, it was voluntary, but everyone knew he was being pushed out. The department wanted a younger image, someone who would embrace all the new technology and procedures. Ellis was seen as old-fashioned, out of touch with modern policing. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, who had trained generations of officers, who had kept their community safe for decades. And in the end, he had been discarded like outdated equipment, his experience and wisdom deemed less valuable than the latest gadgets and theories." Thomas continued eating his soup, unaware of the conversation taking place just 20 feet away. He had learned to exist in his own bubble, to find contentment in small pleasures and simple routines. The soup was good, the coffee was strong, and the rain on the windows created a soothing rhythm that helped quiet the thoughts that sometimes kept him awake at night. He thought about Maria, his wife of 42 years, who had passed away 6 months before his retirement. She had been his anchor, the one person who truly understood the weight he carried each day. She had known when to ask about his work and when to let the silence speak for itself. She had been there through every promotion, every difficult case, every moment when he had questioned whether he was making a difference. Without her, the emptiness of retirement felt overwhelming. The department had been his other family, his source of purpose and identity. When both had been taken from him within such a short time, he had struggled to find meaning in the quiet days that stretched ahead. The diner had become his refuge, a place where he could be alone without feeling entirely isolated. Officer Perez made a decision that would change the trajectory of the evening. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping softly against the floor. Her colleagues looked at her with curiosity and concern, unsure of what she was planning, but recognizing the determination in her posture. "What are you doing?" Martinez whispered. "What I should have done years ago," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. "I never thanked him properly for saving my life. I never told him what his example meant to me as a young officer trying to figure out how to do this job with honor and integrity." She walked across the diner with measured steps, her heart pounding but her resolve unwavering. The other officers watched in silence, understanding that they were witnessing something significant, something that transcended their casual dinner conversation. Thomas looked up as she approached, his weathered face showing mild surprise but no recognition. He had encountered thousands of officers over the years, had trained hundreds of rookies, had worked alongside so many colleagues that individual faces sometimes blurred together in his memory. "Commander Ellis," Perez said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of respect and uncertainty. "I'm Officer Lena Perez. I don't expect you to remember me, but I wanted to thank you for something that happened about 8 years ago." Thomas set down his spoon and looked at her more carefully. There was something familiar about her face, something that stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met," he said politely. "Domestic violence call on Maple Street," Perez continued. "A rookie officer who didn't wait for backup. You probably saved my life that night, and I never got the chance to properly thank you." The memory clicked into place, and Thomas's expression shifted from polite confusion to recognition. "Officer Perez," he said quietly, "I remember now. You were so young, so eager to prove yourself. I was worried you were going to get yourself killed trying to be a hero. You taught me something important that night," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You showed me that real courage isn't about being fearless or taking unnecessary risks. It's about being smart, being patient, being willing to put yourself in danger for the right reasons. That lesson has guided me through every difficult situation I've faced since then." Thomas felt a warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months. To know that his actions had made a difference, that his example had shaped another officer's career, was more meaningful than any retirement ceremony or plaque on the wall. "I was just doing my job," he said, but his voice carried a note of pride that hadn't been there before. "No, sir," Perez replied. "You are doing much more than that. You are showing a scared young officer what it meant to serve with honor, what it meant to put the safety of others above your own, what it meant to be the kind of police officer our community deserves." By now, the other officers had risen from their table and were making their way over. Thomas watched them approach with growing amazement, recognizing in their faces the same dedication and purpose that had driven him throughout his career. Officer Williams stepped forward and extended his hand. "Commander Ellis, I'm Officer Williams. I've been on the force for 10 years, and I've tried to model my career after the standards you set, the training protocols you developed, the emphasis on community engagement, the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. Those principles have guided me every day." Martinez was next. "Sir, I'm Officer Martinez. I've heard so many stories about your service, about the way you cared for your officers and your community. I've always hoped I could live up to the example you set." Officer Chen, despite her youth and relative inexperience, stepped forward with confidence. "Commander Ellis, I'm Officer Chen. I may be new to the force, but I've learned about your legacy through my training and through the stories my colleagues tell. Thank you for showing us what it means to be a police officer." Finally, Officer Johnson, who had been quiet throughout the evening, approached with visible emotion. "Sir, my father served under you for 5 years in the 80s. He always said you were the finest officer he ever worked with, that you treated everyone fairly and never asked anyone to do something you wouldn't do yourself. He passed away 2 years ago, but he never stopped talking about the respect he had for you." Thomas felt tears welling in his eyes as he looked at these 5 young officers, each representing a different generation of law enforcement, each carrying forward the values and principles he had spent his career trying to instill. In their faces, he saw the future of policing, the hope that the profession he loved would continue to evolve and improve. "I don't know what to say," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent the last few months feeling like my career didn't matter, like everything I tried to build had been forgotten or discarded. To hear that what I did made a difference to officers like you, it means more than I can express." The officers stood in a circle around his table, creating an informal ceremony that was more meaningful than any official recognition. Without planning or discussion, they began to demonstrate the respect they felt for this man who had shaped their understanding of what it meant to serve. Officer Perez was the first to place her hand over her heart and offer a slight bow of her head. It was a gesture of respect that transcended rank and years of service, an acknowledgement of the debt they owed to those who had come before them. One by one, the others followed suit. Martinez, Williams, Chen, and Johnson each offered their own silent salute, their own moment of recognition for a man who had dedicated his life to making their community safer. Thomas looked around at their faces, seeing in each one the reflection of his own younger self, the idealism and determination that had driven him to join the force all those years ago. He saw the challenges they would face, the difficult decisions they would have to make, the weight of responsibility they would carry. But he also saw their strength, their commitment to doing what was right even when it was difficult. "You know," he said finally, his voice steady despite the emotion he was feeling, "I always wondered if I made the right choices, if I had been the kind of leader my officers deserved. There were times when I had to make difficult decisions, times when I had to choose between what was popular and what was right. I sometimes worried that I had been too hard on the young officers, too demanding in my expectations." "No, sir," Perez said firmly. "You were exactly what we needed. You showed us that this job isn't just about enforcing laws or making arrests. It's about being part of something bigger than ourselves, about serving a community that depends on us to be our best selves every day." The conversation continued for another hour, with the officers sharing stories of their own experiences and asking Thomas about his career, his philosophy of policing, his advice for navigating the challenges they faced. Thomas found himself energized by their questions, inspired by their dedication, proud of the profession he had devoted his life to serving. As the evening wore on and the diner began to empty, the officers knew their time was coming to an end. They had shifts to prepare for, families to go home to, lives to resume. But none of them wanted to leave this moment, this connection to a man who represented the best of what they aspired to be. Officer Chen, as the youngest member of the group, was given the honor of presenting a small token of their appreciation. She pulled out a notepad and wrote carefully on a piece of paper, then folded it and placed it on the table in front of Thomas. Commander Ellis, she said, we want you to know that your legacy lives on in every officer you trained, every life you touched, every standard you set. You didn't need to say anything tonight for us to recognize you. We remember your service, we honor your sacrifice, and we're committed to carrying forward the values you taught us. Thomas unfolded the note and read the words written in careful handwriting. You didn't need to say anything, sir. We remember. Thank you for showing us what it means to serve with honor. Your legacy lives on in every officer you influenced, every life you saved, every standard you set. We will not forget. He looked up at the 5 young faces surrounding him, seeing in their eyes the same dedication that had driven him throughout his career. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of purpose, a connection to something larger than his own loneliness and disappointment. Thank you, he said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything he was feeling. Thank you for reminding me why I became a police officer in the first place. Thank you for showing me that the work we do matters, that the sacrifices we make have meaning, that the example we set continues to influence others long after we're gone. The officers began to say their goodbyes, each taking a moment to shake Thomas's hand and offer their own words of appreciation. As they prepared to leave, Thomas called out to them one final time. Officers, he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades in command, remember that the badge you wear isn't just a symbol of your authority, it's a reminder of your responsibility. Wear it with pride, but never forget that with great power comes great accountability. Take care of each other, take care of your community, and never lose sight of why you chose this profession. They nodded solemnly, understanding that they had received more than just advice. They had been given a charge, a mission to carry forward the best traditions of law enforcement while adapting to the challenges of a changing world. As the officers left the diner, Thomas remained in his booth, but everything about his posture had changed. His shoulders were straighter, his eyes brighter, his entire demeanor reflecting a renewed sense of purpose. He carefully folded the note and placed it in his jacket pocket, a tangible reminder of an evening that had transformed his understanding of his own legacy. The rain had stopped, and through the window, Thomas could see the first stars appearing in the clearing sky. He finished his soup, which had grown cold during the conversation, and signaled to Betty for his check. But for the first time in months, he wasn't eager to return to the solitude of his empty house. Instead, he found himself thinking about the precinct, about the young officers who were just beginning their careers, about the veterans who were struggling with the same challenges he had faced. He thought about the programs he had started, the initiatives he had championed, the changes he had fought for that had made a real difference in the community. Maybe his retirement didn't have to be the end of his service. Maybe there were other ways to contribute, other opportunities to share his knowledge and experience. Maybe the legacy he had built wasn't finished yet. As he walked to his car, Thomas felt a lightness in his step that hadn't been there in months. The encounter with the 5 officers had reminded him that his life's work had meaning, that the values he had tried to instill in others were still alive and thriving in a new generation of law enforcement professionals. He drove home through the quiet streets of his small town, past the places where he had responded to countless calls, past the neighborhoods where he had built relationships with community members, past the schools where he had spoken to children about safety and responsibility. Each familiar landmark reminded him of the connections he had made, the lives he had touched, the difference he had made in ways both large and small. At home, Thomas sat in his favorite chair and pulled out the note from Officer Chen. He read it again, savoring each word, feeling the gratitude and respect that had been poured into those carefully chosen phrases. Then he reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Hello, Chief Martinez? This is Thomas Ellis. I know we had our differences before my retirement, but I've been thinking about some programs that might benefit the department and the community. I was wondering if you might have some time to talk." The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, as Thomas shared his ideas for mentorship programs, community outreach initiatives, and training protocols that could benefit both new officers and experienced veterans. The chief, who had initially been skeptical, found himself genuinely interested in Thomas's proposals and eager to explore ways to implement them. By the time Thomas hung up the phone, he had agreed to return to the department as a volunteer consultant, working with new recruits and serving as a resource for officers facing difficult situations. It wasn't the same as his old job, but it was a way to continue serving, a way to ensure that his knowledge and experience wouldn't be lost. As he prepared for bed, Thomas reflected on the evening's events. A chance encounter in a small diner had reminded him that retirement didn't have to mean the end of his usefulness, that his legacy was still being written by every officer he had influenced, every life he had touched, every standard he had set. The 5 young officers who had recognized him that night had given him a gift more valuable than any pension or retirement party. They had given him the knowledge that his life's work had meaning, that the sacrifices he had made had been worth it, that the example he had set would continue to influence others long after he was gone. Thomas smiled as he turned off the lights, the note from Officer Chen tucked safely in his jacket pocket. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, new chances to make a difference, new ways to honor the profession he loved. The rain had stopped, the stars were shining, and for the first time in months, Thomas Ellis felt at peace with his place in the world. He had spent his career serving others, and now he understood that service didn't end with retirement. It simply took on new forms, new challenges, new opportunities to make a positive impact on the world around him. The 5 officers who had recognized him that night had reminded him that legacy isn't just about what you accomplish during your active years. It's about the influence you have on others, the values you pass along, the example you set for future generations. As he drifted off to sleep, Thomas dreamed of the young officers who would carry forward the torch of service, who would face new challenges with the same dedication and integrity that had guided him throughout his career. He dreamed of a future where the profession he loved would continue to evolve and improve, where each new generation of officers would build upon the foundation laid by those who came before them. The silent commander was silent no more. He had found his voice again, not through words, but through the recognition that his life's work had meaning, that his legacy was secure in the hands of those who had chosen to follow in his footsteps. And in that knowledge, he found the peace and purpose that had been missing from his retirement, the understanding that true service never ends. It simply transforms, adapts, and continues to make a difference in ways both seen and unseen.